not to be too deep, but to be too deep, it's sort of one of those things where you don't want to harm yourself, but you really don't care what happens. And you really don't feel like you have much to latch onto anymore because you've lost so much of the things that you enjoy. I'm using you in the second person, but really I mean me. I lost all of those things, and it was so hard for me to realize that because you just get so stuck in it. Hi, I'm Joshua. I came here after moving back into my family's home in a small town in Bangs. Previously, I had been going to school, and I was able to get through my bachelor's degree in creative writing poetry. Fun, really cool. I was really, really passionate through school, and then whenever I graduated last May, I sort of just had a moment when I felt like I had everything laid out in front of me, and then I just ripped it to shreds. When I started noticing, like, I am trying to hide in my bedroom right now, I'm not really wanting to go eat. And then the pattern of restriction just sort of got worse. And I only had one more semester of college, and I was powering through, and I was taking such amazing classes. But sometimes in the mornings, I would get halfway there and then just turn around and go home. I was so nervous and freaked out and anxious about what could happen, or not being able to give myself breakfast, so I'm worried about going to my job and being shaky or being not clear-headed, because also my senior year of college I was a writing tutor for students from freshmen all the way up into grad school, and also professors would bring their research, and it's a high pressure job to work on people's academic career in such an intimate way. And I loved it. It was one of the most rewarding things I've ever done. But there were times when I'm like, I didn't have breakfast, and I feel like I'm not making much sense right now. That was awful. I mean, most of the time I would have to force myself to eat just to do that, so that I'm like, I know that I will be a little bit less scatterbrained. But sometimes that didn't help. There were other times when I would really only feed myself because I knew I was going to go out and drink. And so I didn't want to be drinking on an empty stomach. Like, such a horrible motivation. But sometimes that was all I would eat. Like, the most that I've ever engaged in, like, behaviors, purging, things like that, I would say started around December of 2021, when I noticed that being around my family was really, really hard for me. And it was really hard for me to be around them because I didn't want to disappoint them by not eating. I'm Polish, and so a lot of our love and family connection is shown through food. And that's something that's really hard when you're kind of turning that away, and people I was always so afraid of it getting interpreted as something personal. I didn't really know what to do with it or where to put the feelings. Like, I was still in denial and still trying to hide it, and not even really knowing what I was hiding either. I felt like I had nothing, and I lost so much of my identity. And then ED sort of took over, and I was not going out with friends. I lost my job as a server and bartender, which was a really fun job, and I loved the community. And ultimately, it resulted in me moving back in with my parents. Like, it got pretty severe, and I didn't really look like myself, didn't really act like myself. I was like a snarly little gremlin. And it was really sad, and my family kind of just didn't know what to do with me. And my mom found EDS, and I came, and I had a really rough start. I had a really horrible start, and I wanted to leave and go back home, and I needed the tough love from my parents being like, we can't do this. You need to go somewhere where there are people who specialize in helping people like you. I needed a wake-up call, and I needed to get clear of all of that and find somewhere to find myself again. But when you're really in deep and struggling with an eating disorder, a lot of higher level of thinking in your brain sort of shuts down. You turn into, I guess I want to say, a more primal and animalistic version of yourself. Like, you just sort of try to base level get your needs met, and nothing else really happens. So for me, I've always been very creative and artistically driven, and I get so much out of the things that I work at. So like creative writing, poetry was my degree. Like, that's sort of always been an important outlet for me, and I realized something was really wrong when I stopped writing. And also like visual art, I'm sort of like a, I don't want to say jack of all trades because I'm not quite good at everything, but I like to do it all. I like to sculpt. I make all my Halloween costumes. I paint, and sort of when I realized that I was losing all of that, I just became a shell. I sort of, would just look in the mirror and think like, wow, you look great, and then sleep for 3 days. Like, it was such a disordered level of thinking. I feel like, always having been a smaller person, people praised me for that, and so I leaned in. And when you value that validation far too much, it's so easy to become so attached to the ED behaviors and to all of these negative things that you feel like are helping in some way, but they're really not. It's really just digging you deeper into somewhere where you get very lost. And I lost my job in like September, and I pretty much stayed in my apartment and did nothing and did not work for months. But it was so bad and so never who I was. Like, my house was a mess. I would always look at my cat though, because I always took care of her. Nothing ever got in the way of that. And I have to really thank her for keeping me alive, because it's like, not to be too deep, but to be too deep, it's sort of one of those things where you don't want to harm yourself, but you really don't care what happens. And you really don't feel like you have much to latch onto anymore, because you've lost so much of the things that you enjoy. I'm using you in the second person, but really I mean me. I lost all of those things, and it was so hard for me to realize that, because you just get so stuck in it. Mine is so anxiety related. So throughout high school and mostly through college, I started abusing marijuana, which of course doesn't exactly help with an eating disorder. You think it would give you the munchies, but sometimes if you smoke instead of eating, you're just creating a vicious cycle. Everybody copes differently, and some people have very maladaptive coping mechanisms. So like for me, it was drugs, and not all of them are bad, but it was also dancing and going out. But that sort of skews where you find your validation, because I have a poem that I wrote. I'm going to be vulnerable, and one of the lines is, like, I brushed elbows with death for free drinks, and sort of is true, not necessarily in the people that I was surrounding myself with, but what I was doing to myself, thinking I would find validation through that. That was really hard, and hard to write, but cathartic. Like, I needed to address so many things before I could get back to a point where I felt like I could be creative and I could do those things again. And then using that also as a coping skill to work through other things has been really cool. So a lot of the groups here at EDS are sort of targeted towards enabling you to figure things out in an artistic way. I personally just use the prompts as somewhere to start, and I didn't restrict myself in what I wanted to draw or paint or elaborate through any sort of creative medium. You're not graded on anything. The prompts are pretty loose, and they are so small and low pressure that it's it's nice to start to re-engage in things that previously you had put down for so long. And it's so low pressure. It's not, nobody even has to look at it if you don't want them to. But for me, exercising vulnerability and showing people and making myself show people and, finally reading poems in a group and hearing what people had to say and actually listening was really, really great. And it was really validating. But I needed to get to a point where I found the validation from myself again first. It had to be about what I thought of it first. And I needed to say that I'm proud of this again first, before anyone else could, even. Before I let them, honestly. Because I was so private with a lot of the things I did. And then I started, showing a little bit, and mostly showing staff, and then, reading poems or showing things in private sessions with my clinician, and it all sort of snowballed from there. And it's been great. It's been really great. I feel like I've tapped back into something that I had abandoned, Being a part of the LGBTQ community myself, it's so apparent, so many of the issues that could lead into somebody having an eating disorder. Like, there's so much weight placed upon vanity. And for me, being a smaller man, like, it's hard to deal with, but that's also fetishized. And that's really uncomfortable to deal with. And it can trigger a lot of thoughts and emotions that, if you feed into them, lead you down a very dark path. There is so much of a focus also on being perfect and being presentable always. There are so many stigmas, so many universally accepted things about our community that aren't true, that we have to constantly battle against. Fighting just to feel like you can express your identity and express yourself honestly can sometimes make you lose what you were fighting for in the first place. And it's so jarring not being able to talk with other people in your community about this. It's sort of an unspoken thing. I heard statistics that, LGBTQ people are at such a higher likelihood of developing eating disorders, and never really understood why. And that was a really difficult and uncomfortable part of me coming here and sort of trying to sort out why for me that could be. And mine was definitely placing way too much validation from people complimenting me externally, seeking validation just on my identity. I discovered that was a big part of it too. Not having somebody to validate my identity the whole time I was growing up really affected me, and it really affected where I went and sought certain things, and I did not seek them in the right places. And that's such a very common thing within my community, of misguidedness and adults that really didn't get the opportunity to go through a lot of things that other people went through growing up, because they weren't honest, or they weren't able to be honest about who they were, or they had to fight too hard for their identity. And it's very sad. It's very sad. And I would really encourage anyone in a situation similar to me to try to take a step back and look at things honestly, even if it's uncomfortable. Also, being a man with ED and seeking treatment for it, I didn't realize that there was such a small percentage of men with ED that actually ever get treatment. Ever at all. There's so much strength in vulnerability. Learning how to be vulnerable again has been something that has kind of saved me. And letting go of the hard exterior, my hard masculine exterior for sure. But, I was still trying to be very guarded. I put up this front of being, a perfect little gay boy. I don't know, I just tried to fit into the box that people put me in, and leaning into that ended up not going as great as I wanted it to for me, and it did not lead me to where I thought it would. And I think that's been one of the most rewarding parts of it all, is like looking in the mirror and seeing myself again, and seeing like a much, I don't want to say better, but a better version of myself, honestly. Yeah. It's not hard for me to see why it's harder for men to seek treatment for ED. Like, it is so still somewhat socially unacceptable to show that vulnerability and that softer side. All of the coded language that we have for men being vulnerable is so odd. Like, just be a person. It's so simple. So it's just stigmatized so much socially to see a man be emotional, really, in any capacity, or super passionate about something that isn't A, B, or C, insert whatever category you would like here. I think it's really, really, really important for anyone, but men in particular, to be honest about it. Vulnerability is not a weakness, and I still think it's garbage that men can't be weak. I just never fit that mold or that bubble, and I think there's a lot of people who truly don't, and are maybe just trying to. But it's not worth it. Life's too short. Do whatever you want. That's one of my favorite cliches. Life's too short. Ultimately, I had to take a step back to take care of myself and prioritize myself. And it's okay to do so. It is so okay to put your life on pause. Nothing is that important that you can't leave for 30 or 60 or 90 days and just go sort something out. You know, the ED is such, like, it's still mysterious in the world and socially, and I think having a place that so solely focuses on it in such a wonderful environment and with such like a wonderful staff has sort of been transformative. And being around people who work in the field has almost made me want to change my career goals and just try some new things out before I go back for my master's, because I am still very goal oriented. As someone who was very resistant to come to treatment, I would say, in the first place, just remember that even if you feel like you might be able to do all of these things and accomplish recovery on your own and at home, I had to constantly remind myself that if I could have done it at home, I would have. And, you know, home is where I got bad. And home is where I was comfortable. And I had to grow through a very uncomfortable situation, which uncomfortable situations force you to grow. And it's such a healthy thing to go through, and a healthy amount of anxiety to place yourself under in an environment where there are people who are there to help you and there to do those things for you and with you and alongside you as you go through it all. You know, there are peers to help you, there's staff to help you, there's an amazing outdoor environment to reestablish yourself in connection with nature. Like, there's so many wonderful parts about coming to treatment, and it doesn't have to be a super painful experience or a negative one. Going through treatment can be something that is ultimately very positive, and it's meant to be beneficial. And for me, it really has been. Just don't be afraid to reach out and ask for help, because it's the hardest part. But putting up the white flag and admitting that you can't do it on your own is the most important part of seeking recovery.